Elephants are often observed moving slowly through forests and savannas, feeding, resting, and traveling along routes that appear unchanged over generations. From a distance, their behavior seems straightforward. They walk, they eat, they drink, and they move on. These actions are familiar enough that they rarely invite closer examination. When elephants push over young trees, strip bark, or follow the same paths repeatedly, these behaviors are frequently interpreted as simple byproducts of size. The assumption is that large animals inevitably damage their surroundings, and that the landscape adjusts passively in response. In this view, elephants are present within ecosystems, but not functionally central to them. However, careful observation challenges this assumption. The environments where elephants persist over long periods exhibit structural patterns that differ measurably from similar habitats where elephants are absent. Vegetation density, water distribution, and the spatial arrangement of plant communities follow different trajectories, even under comparable climate conditions. These differences do not arise suddenly, nor are they tied to dramatic events. They emerge gradually, through repeated interaction between behavior and environment. At first glance, it is not obvious why these patterns exist. The behaviors themselves appear inefficient or even disruptive. Breaking trees does not resemble construction. Creating open paths does not suggest long-term planning. Yet these actions occur consistently, across regions and populations, suggesting that they serve a function beyond immediate survival. To understand this behavior, it is necessary to move beyond how it appears and examine how it functions within biological and ecological systems. Only then does the underlying logic begin to emerge. In regions where elephants are present year after year, a consistent set of observable actions shapes the landscape around them. Elephants push against trees while feeding, strip bark from trunks, and repeatedly move along the same routes between feeding grounds and water sources. These behaviors occur regardless of season and are performed by individuals of different ages and social groups. At the surface level, they appear to be incidental outcomes of size and movement rather than deliberate patterns. These actions tend to occur under specific environmental conditions. Tree pushing and bark removal are most common in areas where woody vegetation dominates available forage. Repeated path use increases during dry periods, when elephants travel predictable distances between limited water sources and feeding areas. Soil compaction and vegetation breakage are therefore concentrated along these corridors. While feeding-related disturbance spreads outward across surrounding habitat, the behavior is not random, but it is also not targeted toward reshaping the environment. From an adaptive perspective, these actions address multiple biological constraints simultaneously. Elephants require large quantities of low and mid-height vegetation to meet daily energy needs. By breaking branches and trees, they access food sources that would otherwise remain unavailable. Repeated movement along the same routes reduces energy expenditure by minimizing resistance and maintaining navigable terrain. What appears inefficient at the level of individual plants becomes efficient when considered in terms of long-term energy balance. These behaviors also solve spatial problems. Large-bodied animals are limited by dense vegetation that restricts movement and visibility. By maintaining open pathways and mixed vegetation structure, elephants reduce the energetic cost of travel and lower the risk associated with navigating enclosed spaces. The resulting landscape supports consistent access to food and water without requiring constant exploration of new routes. There are trade-offs. Breaking trees reduces the availability of mature canopy cover in localized areas. Bark stripping can damage individual plants, sometimes leading to mortality. Energy is expended in pushing and moving vegetation rather than exclusively in feeding. However, these costs are offset by gains in accessibility, movement, efficiency, and sustained forage availability over time. When viewed through this functional lens, the behavior persists not because it alters ecosystems intentionally, but because it consistently solves recurring biological problems. The environmental changes that follow are secondary effects, emerging from behaviors optimized for survival efficiency. rather than landscape modification. The expression of this behavior is closely tied to environmental context rather than to individual variation. Elephants do not break vegetation uniformly across all habitats. The intensity and form of disturbance shift in response to vegetation type, seasonal resource availability, and landscape constraints. These patterns become apparent when the same populations are observed across different regions or under changing conditions. In areas with dense woody growth, tree pushing and branch breaking occur more frequently. These environments limit access to foliage at reachable heights, increasing reliance on mechanical force to obtain food. During dry seasons, when grasses decline and water sources become more concentrated, elephants travel along narrower corridors. Repeated use of these routes increases soil compaction and vegetation clearance, reinforcing established paths rather than creating new ones. Rainfall patterns also influence behavior. After periods of heavy rain, vegetation growth accelerates, and elephants disperse more widely across feeding areas. Disturbance becomes more diffuse, spread across a larger area. During prolonged dry periods, movement contracts around remaining resources, intensifying impact in specific zones. The behavior responds dynamically to environmental pressure, rather than following a fixed pattern. This context dependence explains why similar elephant populations can produce different ecological outcomes across regions. In open savannas, vegetation disturbance maintains grassland structure. In forested systems, the same actions prevent canopy closure and support mixed habitats. The behavior itself remains consistent, but its effects vary according to environmental constraints. From a functional standpoint, this flexibility increases survival efficiency. Elephants adjust movement and feeding patterns to minimize energy expenditure while maximizing resource access under prevailing conditions. The behavior is not optimized for altering the environment, but for navigating it effectively. Environmental modification emerges as a byproduct of repeated adaptation to local conditions. Limitations remain. In heavily fragmented landscapes or areas with restricted movement, elephants are unable to express this behavior across sufficient spatial scales. Corridors narrow, resources concentrate, and disturbance becomes localized to the point of degradation rather than regulation. Under these conditions, the same behavior that supports balance in expansive systems can contribute to instability. Understanding these triggers clarifies why the behavior persists across evolutionary timescales. It is not a fixed response, but a context-sensitive solution to recurring ecological challenges. Its continued presence reflects its effectiveness in managing spatial and energetic constraints imposed by the environment. When examined beyond immediate context, the adaptive function of this behavior becomes clearer through its cumulative effects. By repeatedly modifying vegetation and maintaining open movement corridors, elephants reduce the energetic costs associated with foraging and travel. Energy that would otherwise be spent navigating dense growth or searching for alternative routes is conserved and redirected toward feeding efficiency and physiological maintenance. This efficiency has direct implications for survival. Large-bodied animals operate under strict energetic constraints. Daily intake must remain high and consistent to support metabolism, growth, and reproduction. Behaviors that reduce travel resistance and increase access to forage lower the risk of energetic shortfall, particularly during periods of scarcity. The persistence of these actions across populations suggests that they reliably meet these requirements. The behavior also influences spatial predictability. Stable pathways and feeding zones allow elephants to revisit known resource areas without extensive exploration. This reduces exposure to unfamiliar terrain and limits unnecessary energy expenditure. Over time, these patterns support consistent movement strategies that align with seasonal resource distribution. There are measurable costs associated with this strategy. Repeated physical interaction with vegetation requires muscular effort and increases wear on the body. In some cases, access to certain food sources involves breaking resistant plant material, which demands additional energy. However, these costs are offset by long-term gains in accessibility and movement efficiency. The balance favors persistence rather than elimination of the behavior. From an ecological perspective, the behavior indirectly supports system-level stability by distributing pressure across the landscape. Vegetation is disturbed in a pattern that prevents overconcentration of growth in specific zones. This distribution reduces competition among plants and moderates resource availability for other species. While these outcomes are not the primary driver of the behavior, they reinforce environmental conditions that remain compatible with elephant survival. The behavior persists because it operates within a narrow window of effectiveness. It functions best in environments where movement is unrestricted and resources are distributed across large areas. When these conditions are met, the behavior solves recurring biological problems efficiently. When they are not, limitations become apparent, and the behavior's benefits diminish. Despite its effectiveness under suitable conditions, this behavior is constrained by biological and environmental limits that prevent unlimited benefit. The physical demands involved in breaking vegetation and maintaining movement corridors require significant muscular effort. Over time, this contributes to wear on joints, increased caloric demand, and greater exposure to injury, particularly in older individuals. These costs place an upper boundary on how frequently and intensely the behavior can be expressed. Resource availability further limits its effectiveness. In environments where vegetation regrowth is slow, repeated disturbance can reduce forage quality rather than improve access. Under prolonged drought or in degraded habitats, the balance between effort and reward shifts. Energy spent modifying vegetation may no longer be recovered through increased feeding efficiency, narrowing the conditions under which the behavior remains advantageous. Spatial constraints also impose limits. The behavior depends on the ability to move freely across large areas. Fragmented landscapes restrict movement and concentrate activity into smaller zones. When corridors are constrained by human land use or natural barriers, repeated use intensifies local impact. What functions as regulation at scale becomes degradation when space is insufficient to distribute pressure. Physiological constraints reinforce these limits. Large body size restricts agility and increases dependence on predictable routes. While this favors the maintenance of established pathways, it reduces flexibility when environments change rapidly. Sudden alterations in resource distribution, whether driven by climate variability or habitat loss, can outpace the behavior's ability to compensate. These trade-offs explain why the behavior has not evolved toward greater intensity or specialization. Its persistence reflects optimization within a narrow functional range rather than continual improvement. The behavior remains effective because it balances energetic gain against physical cost under historically stable conditions. When those conditions shift, the limitations become more visible. The same actions that once supported efficiency may no longer yield proportional benefit. This does not negate the behavior's adaptive value, but it clarifies the boundaries within which it operates. Understanding these constraints completes the functional picture, showing not only why the behavior works, but why it cannot work indefinitely under all circumstances. Across different regions, the same underlying behavior produces distinct outcomes shaped by local environmental conditions. In open savannas, repeated vegetation disturbance maintains grass dominance and prevents encroachment by woody plants. Movement corridors remain broad, and the effects of tree pushing are dispersed over large areas. Here, the behavior supports a stable balance between grasses and scattered trees, aligning with seasonal grazing patterns. In forested environments, the expression shifts. Dense vegetation limits visibility and access to mid-level foliage, increasing the frequency of branch breaking and tree pushing. Openings created through repeated use allow light to penetrate lower layers, altering plant composition over time. The behavior remains consistent, but its ecological footprint becomes more pronounced due to slower vegetation recovery and tighter spatial constraints. Seasonal variability further modifies outcomes. Regions with predictable wet and dry cycles show rhythmic patterns of disturbance and regrowth. Vegetation recovers during wet periods, distributing impact across the landscape. In contrast, Areas with irregular rainfall experience uneven recovery. Disturbance concentrates in fewer locations, increasing pressure on localized plant communities while leaving others relatively untouched. Population density also plays a role. Where elephant numbers remain within historical ranges, effects scale proportionally to available space and resources. In areas with elevated densities or restricted movement, similar behaviors generate amplified local change. This does not indicate a change in behavioral strategy, but a shift in context that alters consequences. These regional variations demonstrate that behavior adapts to conditions rather than adhering to a single outcome. The biological mechanism remains stable, while environmental parameters determine how its effects manifest. This variability underscores the importance of scale and context in interpreting ecological roles. Behavior adapts to conditions, not to narratives. The persistence of this behavior is bounded by biological constraints that limit how far it can be modified or intensified. Anatomical structure places clear boundaries on force generation and movement. While elephants possess the mass and musculature necessary to push and break vegetation, this capacity is balanced against skeletal stress and joint load. Repeated exertion increases wear over time, particularly in weight-bearing limbs, setting practical limits on frequency and duration. Physiological demands further constrain the behavior. Large body size requires a constant balance between energy intake and expenditure. Activities that involve sustained physical effort must be offset by reliable access to forage. When environmental conditions reduce food availability, the margin for such effort narrows. The behavior remains viable only when energetic costs are consistently recovered through improved access to resources. Thermal regulation also plays a role. Physical exertion generates heat, and in warmer climates, this limits activity during peak temperatures. As a result, expression of the behavior is temporally constrained, occurring more often during cooler periods, or under conditions that allow heat dissipation. This restriction prevents continuous application and reinforces its episodic nature. Developmental factors add another layer of limitation. Younger individuals lack the strength to produce the same effects, while older individuals experience declining capacity. The behavior, therefore, operates most effectively within a specific age range, contributing to variability in its expression across populations and time. These constraints explain why the behavior has remained stable rather than evolving toward greater intensity. Its form reflects a balance between effectiveness and cost, shaped by physical and energetic realities. The behavior persists not because it maximizes impact, but because it operates efficiently within these limits. By recognizing these boundaries, the behavior can be understood as a solution tailored to specific conditions rather than a universally optimal strategy. Its effectiveness depends on alignment between anatomy, physiology, and environment. When that alignment holds, the behavior contributes to stability. When it does not, its influence diminishes, revealing the limits imposed by biology itself. Examining this behavior through a functional lens reveals how easily perception can obscure biological logic. What initially appears inefficient or disruptive becomes coherent when considered in relation to energy balance, movement constraints, and long-term survival efficiency. The behavior persists not because it alters ecosystems intentionally, but because it reliably solves recurring problems imposed by size, resource distribution, and environmental variability. Which aspect of this behavior challenged your assumptions the most? The way repeated movement reshapes access to resources, the role of environmental context in determining outcomes, or the limits imposed by biological constraints, and which animal behavior should be examined next to better understand how function, rather than appearance, shapes life in natural systems.